Before we begin, viewer discretion is strongly advised. The following content is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. This is the official courtroom testimony from day 23 of the federal trial of Sean Diddy Combs, as reported by Inner City Press. No one in the packed courtroom was prepared for what happened next. When the prosecutor called Curtis James Jackson III, the courtroom didn't gasp. It went dead silent. The kind of silence that happens when everyone's brain needs a moment to process what they just heard. 50 Cent walked in like he was entering a high-stakes poker game. Not rushed, not dramatic. Just a man who'd been playing the long game for 13 years and was finally ready to show his cards. He wore a simple navy suit, carried a leather portfolio, and moved with the confidence of someone who'd done his homework. As he passed the gallery, he nodded to a few familiar faces, journalists who'd covered his beef with Diddy industry executives, who'd watched this saga unfold in real time. But when he reached the witness stand, something interesting happened. Instead of immediately taking his seat, he stopped and looked directly at Sean Combs for the first time in years. Not with anger or triumph, but with the cool assessment of a chess player studying his opponent's final position. Diddy, for his part, stared back with the blank expression of a man trying very hard to look unbothered. 50 Cent sat down, adjusted his tie, and opened his portfolio. Inside were printed screenshots, text message records, and what appeared to be a timeline written in his own handwriting. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying that familiar Queen's accent, but none of the usual swagger. "I brought receipts." The judge nodded. "Proceed, Mr. Jackson." The prosecutor approached. "Mr. Jackson, you've had a very public relationship with the defendant over the past decade. Can you tell us how that began?" 50 Cent pulled out a single sheet of paper from his portfolio. It started with a conversation at a funeral, Biggie's funeral to be exact. But it really began when I realized that conversation wasn't about grief, it was about opportunity. March 18th, 1997. 50 Cent began reading from his notes. "I was young, still coming up, but I was at Biggie's funeral because that's what you did in the hip-hop community. You showed respect." He looked up from his papers. Diddy was there, obviously. But what struck me wasn't his grief, it was his calculation. Even at a funeral, he was working the room talking to people about carrying on Big's legacy, about what Big would have wanted. The courtroom was completely focused now. This wasn't the story anyone expected to hear. I overheard him talking to someone from the label. I won't say who, but they're still alive, and they know what they heard. Diddy said, and I'm quoting from memory here, "Big's gone, but his catalog ain't. We gotta position this right. Make it about the music, not the circumstances." 50 Cent paused, letting that sink in. At the time, I thought it was just business. Grief makes people say things they don't mean, right? But looking back, that was the moment I realized Sean Combs saw opportunity where everyone else saw tragedy. The prosecutor leaned forward. "Did this observation influence your later relationship with Mr. Combs?" "Not immediately," 50 replied. "I was focused on my own career, but I filed it away, you know. And over the years, I started noticing a pattern. Artists would come to Bad Boy full of life, full of dreams, and they'd leave different, broken, or they wouldn't leave at all." He pulled out another document. "I started keeping track, not officially, just notes. Artists who signed to Bad Boy, what happened to their careers, their personal lives. The pattern was disturbing." What became clear as 50 Cent's testimony continued was that his approach to Diddy hadn't been emotional or impulsive. It had been methodical, almost scientific. "See, I'm not just a rapper," he explained to the jury. "I'm a businessman. I understand market dynamics, power structures, how influence works. And what I was seeing with Diddy's operation didn't make business sense unless there was something else going on." He opened his portfolio to a section filled with printed social media posts arranged chronologically. Every public comment I made about Diddy was strategic. I wasn't just talking trash, I was conducting market research. The prosecutor displayed one of 50's early posts on the courtroom screens. It showed Diddy at an industry event with 50's caption, "Interesting energy at these industry parties. Some cats move different when they think nobody's watching." This post from 2012. 50 explained, got 847 comments. But more importantly, it got 23 direct messages from people in the industry sharing their own observations about Diddy's behavior. That's when I realized I wasn't the only one who had noticed something was off. He described developing what he called a information network, industry insiders, former bad boy employees, even security personnel who would share stories and observations about Diddy's private activities. I wasn't paying anyone for information, he clarified. People were reaching out to me because they saw I was willing to ask questions nobody else would ask. I became like a repository for industry concerns about Sean Combs. The methodical nature of his approach was evident in his documentation. Every social media post, every public comment, every business decision was recorded and cross-referenced with the intelligence he was gathering. I treated this like a long-term investment, he said. I was building a case piece by piece, post by post, until the picture became clear enough for other people to see. When 50 Cent reached the infamous text message incident, his demeanor shifted slightly. The businessman facade gave way to something more personal, more visceral. January 15th, 2013, 4:27 a.m., he said, pulling out a printed screenshot. I was at home in Connecticut actually reading a bedtime story to my son. My phone buzzed and I almost ignored it because of the hour. He held up the screenshot for the jury to see. The message said, "Yo, Fifth, come through. Let's have a little Kirok together." But it wasn't just the words, it was the presentation. Heart emoji clinking glasses sent at 1:30 in the morning to a man with a child. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of reporters typing. Now I've gotten late-night business calls before. Emergency meetings, time-sensitive deals. But this wasn't business. The tone, the emojis, the hour, it felt like a proposition. And not the kind you make to a business associate. 50 Cent's response, he testified, was immediate and unambiguous. "Bro, you texting the wrong dude." But here's what was interesting, he continued. Within 24 hours, I started getting calls from mutual acquaintances, asking if I had disrespected Sean. Not asking what happened, not asking for my side of the story, asking if I had disrespected him by declining his invitation. He pulled out another document. I started documenting those calls too. Who called what they said, how they framed the situation. Because it became clear that declining Diddy's advances wasn't just seen as a personal choice, it was seen as a professional insult. The prosecutor asked, "How did this incident change your approach to Mr. Combs?" 50 Cent's answer was direct. It confirmed everything I'd been suspecting. This wasn't just about business practices or artistic exploitation. This was about a man who believed his wealth and power gave him access to anyone he wanted whenever he wanted. And when someone said no, there would be consequences. Following the text message incident, 50 Cent's public approach to Diddy evolved from subtle observations to what he called strategic psychological pressure. I realized that direct confrontation wouldn't work, he explained. Diddy had too many resources, too many connections. But social media was different. It was democratic. I could reach millions of people without going through gatekeepers who might be in his pocket. He described his posting strategy with the precision of a military campaign. Every meme, every joke, every seemingly random observation was designed to make people uncomfortable about Diddy's public image. I was creating cognitive dissonance. The prosecutor displayed a series of 50's posts, each one showing Diddy in what appeared to be overly intimate situations with other men, accompanied by 50's signature commentary. This post from March 2014, 50 explained pointing to a photo of Diddy embracing another man at a party. Got 2.3 million views and 45,000 comments. But more importantly, it got shared by people who added their own observations about Diddy's behavior. The strategy was working according to 50's testimony. I wasn't just posting content, I was creating a conversation. People started sharing their own stories, their own observations. The narrative was shifting from successful mogul to something's not right here. But the campaign came with costs. Radio stations started pulling my music. Collaboration opportunities dried up. Industry events became awkward. But I knew that backing down would mean other people would continue to suffer in silence. 50 Cent described receiving direct threats during this period. Not from Diddy himself, but from people in his orbit. Vague warnings about being careful and not biting the hand that feeds you. The message was clear: stop talking or face consequences. Instead of backing down, he doubled down. I started my own liquor brand specifically to compete with his, not just for market share, but to create a platform for messaging about what real leadership looks like versus what Diddy represented. 50 Cent's entry into the spirits industry wasn't just about profit. It was about creating an alternative narrative to Diddy's carefully crafted image. When I launched Branson Cognac and Le Chemin du Roi, he testified, I positioned them as drinks for real men. Everyone thought I was just taking shots at his product quality. But I was really talking about character, about authenticity, about what happens when the cameras stop rolling. The marketing campaigns were deliberately provocative. My ads emphasized tradition, masculinity, authentic relationships. Everything that Diddy's brand represented the opposite of based on what I was hearing from my sources. He pulled out financial documents showing the impact of his strategy. Within 2 years, my brands were capturing market share not just from Ciroc, but from the entire premium spirits category. We weren't just selling alcohol, we were selling an alternative to what Diddy represented. The competition extended beyond marketing into direct business interference. I started reaching out to Diddy's distribution partners, his marketing agencies, his celebrity endorsers, not to badmouth him directly, but to offer them better deals, more authentic partnerships. 50 Cent described this as economic warfare. I was systematically undermining his business empire while building my own. Every dollar that went to my brands was a dollar that didn't go to his. Every partnership I secured was one less resource for him to use. The strategy was having the desired effect. Industry insiders started telling me that Diddy was becoming increasingly paranoid about my activities. He was asking questions about my business meetings, my partnerships, my plans. I was living rent-free in his head. But the real victory, according to 50's testimony, was cultural. I was changing the conversation about what success looked like in hip-hop. Instead of flash and parties and excess, I was promoting substance and authenticity and real relationships. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. As 50 Cent's campaign against Diddy intensified, he developed what he described as an informal intelligence network within the entertainment industry. I wasn't running a spy operation, he clarified, but people started coming to me with information because they knew I was willing to listen and act on what I heard. He described receiving regular updates from former Bad Boy employees, security personnel, industry executives, and even law enforcement contacts about Diddy's activities. A former security guard reached out in 2016. 50 testified, pulling out a printed email. He'd worked Diddy's private parties for 3 years. He told me about rooms that guests weren't allowed to enter, about young people who arrived at parties, but didn't leave with the other guests, about activities that had nothing to do with music or business. The information was disturbing, but difficult to verify. I couldn't go to the police with secondhand accounts from anonymous sources, but I could use the information to ask better questions, to post more targeted content, to make Diddy increasingly uncomfortable. 50 Cent described developing a system for vetting information. I would cross-reference stories, look for patterns, verify details where possible. I wasn't just collecting gossip, I was building a case. The network grew organically. Word spread that I was someone who would listen to these stories without judgment, who would protect sources, who would act on credible information. People started reaching out from all over the industry. By 2020, according to his testimony, 50 Cent had documented accounts from over 30 individuals describing inappropriate behavior by Diddy. Victims, witnesses, employees, even family members of people who'd been harmed. The pattern was undeniable. The announcement of surviving Diddy represented the culmination of 50 Cent's decade-long investigation, but it also marked a strategic shift from guerrilla warfare to formal documentation. By 2023, I had enough material for multiple documentaries. He testified. Victim testimonies, financial records, security footage, internal communications. But I knew that releasing it as a 50 Cent production would allow people to dismiss it as a personal vendetta. The Netflix partnership was crucial. I needed a platform with credibility, with fact-checking resources, with legal teams that could protect sources and verify claims. This couldn't look like a hit piece. It had to look like journalism. 50 Cent described the documentary as insurance policy. Once I announced it publicly, with major backing, I became harder to silence. Too many people knew about the project. Too many resources were invested. The story was going to come out regardless of what happened to me. The announcement had immediate effects. Within days, I started getting calls from people who'd been afraid to speak before. The documentary gave them a legitimate platform, a way to tell their stories, without seeming like they were just trying to hurt Diddy. But it also escalated the stakes. I started getting more serious threats, not just about my career, but about my safety, my family's safety. I had to increase security, change my routines, be more careful about who I trusted. The federal raids in March 2024 vindicated 50's approach. When those raids happened, suddenly my petty beef started looking like investigative journalism. People who dismissed me as a troll were suddenly asking how I'd known this was coming. As evidence mounted during the federal investigation, 50 Cent's years of social media posts began to look less like random trolling and more like a coherent warning system. People started going back through my Instagram, my Twitter, looking at posts from 2012, 2015, 2018. He testified. Suddenly, jokes that seemed random at the time were making perfect sense in the context of federal charges. He pulled out a collection of his own posts arranged chronologically. This post from 2017 shows Diddy at a party with the caption, "Different energy when you think nobody's watching." At the time, people thought I was just being petty. Now they understand I was documenting behavioral patterns. Another post from 2019 showed Diddy with several young men at a private event. 50's caption had read, "Mentorship looks different for everybody, I guess." I couldn't say what I really suspected, 50 explained, but I could plant seeds, make people think, create enough discomfort that they'd start asking their own questions. The prosecutor asked, "Were these posts based on specific information you'd received?" "Every single one," 50 replied. "I never posted anything that wasn't based on credible intelligence from my network." The jokes were real, but the information behind them was serious. He described the posts as breadcrumbs leading to the truth. I was creating a public record of suspicious behavior, documenting patterns that would make sense once the full story came out. The strategy required patience. I knew that eventually, the truth would surface through official channels. When that happened, I wanted there to be a public record showing that the warning signs had been there all along. When federal agents raided Diddy's properties in March 2024, 50 Cent's immediate response became part of hip-hop legend. "Told you, Netflix, let's talk." I posted that within hours of the raids being reported. He testified, "Not to gloat, but to establish a timeline. I wanted it on record that I'd been warning people about this for over a decade." The vindication was immediate and overwhelming. My phone didn't stop ringing for weeks. Reporters, industry executives, even some of the people who'd criticized me for years, they all wanted to know how I'd known this was coming. But 50 Cent emphasized that the vindication wasn't the point. I didn't spend 13 years and millions of dollars building a case against Diddy so I could say, "I told you so." I did it because I couldn't live with myself, knowing what I knew and doing nothing about it. The federal charges aligned almost perfectly with the patterns 50 had documented. Sexual assault, trafficking, coercion, using business relationships to exploit vulnerable people. Everything I'd been hinting at for years was suddenly part of an official federal indictment. He described feeling a mixture of vindication and sadness. I was right, but being right meant that people had been suffering while I was building my case. That's something I'll have to live with. The documentary project took on new significance after the raids. What had started as an exposé became a historical record. We weren't just telling a story, we were documenting how a predator operated in plain sight for decades. As his testimony neared its conclusion, 50 Cent addressed the personal and professional costs of his 13-year campaign against Diddy. People asked me if it was worth it. He said, his voice carrying the weight of those years. 13 years of my life, millions in lost opportunities, constant threats, damaged relationships. Was it worth it to bring down Sean Combs? He paused, looking directly at the jury. I lost radio play. I lost collaboration opportunities. I lost friendships with people who thought I was obsessed or jealous. I had to hire additional security for my family. I had to be careful about where I went, who I trusted, what I said in private. But the alternative, he emphasized, was unacceptable. Every day I stayed quiet was another day someone else's child could get hurt. Every opportunity I gave Sean Combs to continue operating was another chance for him to destroy someone's life. 50 Cent described the moment he realized the true scope of his responsibility. In 2019, I got a call from a mother whose son had been signed to Bad Boy as a teenager. By the time she called me, he was dead. Overdose. She said, "Mr. Jackson, I wish someone had warned us about that man." That call, he testified, eliminated any doubt about his mission. I realized that my platform, my resources, my willingness to speak truth to power, those weren't just business advantages. They were moral obligations. The financial cost was significant. I estimate I lost somewhere between $5,100 million in opportunities over the years because of my stance against Diddy. Radio deals, endorsements, collaborations, business partnerships, doors that closed because I wouldn't stay quiet. But the personal cost was higher. I became known as the guy who was obsessed with Diddy. People thought I was jealous, petty, unable to move on. That reputation followed me everywhere, affected every relationship, every business deal, every public appearance. 50 Cent's closing testimony was delivered with the calm confidence of a man who had played the longest possible game and was finally ready to collect his winnings. Sean Combs built his empire on a foundation of exploitation, manipulation, and abuse. He stated, looking directly at Diddy for the first time since the beginning of his testimony. He used his wealth and influence to silence victims, intimidate witnesses, and maintain a system that protected predators. He opened his portfolio one final time, pulling out a single sheet of paper. This is a list of everyone who reached out to me over the years with stories about Diddy's behavior. Victims, witnesses, employees, family members. 47 names. 47 people who were too afraid to speak publicly, but trusted me with their truth. The courtroom was completely silent. I kept their secrets for years while I built a case strong enough to protect them. I endured criticism, threats, and professional consequences because I knew that eventually the truth would surface through official channels. When that happened, I wanted to be ready. 50 Cent's voice grew stronger. This trial isn't about hip-hop beef or personal vendettas. It's about accountability. It's about a system that allowed one man to harm dozens of people because he was wealthy, well-connected, and dangerous. He closed his portfolio and stood up. I spent 13 years gathering evidence-building networks, creating public awareness, and protecting sources. Not because I hated Sean Combs, but because I believed in justice. Looking directly at Diddy, he delivered his final statement. "You thought you could intimidate me, like you intimidated everyone else. You thought my success made me just another asset you could acquire or destroy. But you miscalculated. I'm not one of your artists. I'm not one of your victims. I'm your reckoning." The judge called for a brief recess, but the courtroom remained frozen. 50 Cent's testimony had accomplished something unprecedented. It had transformed a decade of apparent celebrity feuding into a coherent narrative of predator and protector silence and resistance power and justice. As he walked past the defense table, Diddy finally looked up, meeting 50 Cent's eyes for the first time during the testimony. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it spoke volumes about power, accountability, and the price of truth. Outside the courthouse, 50 Cent faced the inevitable crowd of reporters and cameras. His response was characteristically direct. "The numbers don't lie. I kept the receipts. Now let the jury do the math." As he walked away, one reporter shouted, "Any regrets about the last 13 years?" 50 Cent stopped, turned back, and smiled. "Yeah, I regret it took this long." The hip-hop world would spend years processing the implications of 50 Cent's testimony. But one thing was already clear. The man who had built his career on being the smartest person in the room had just played his longest, most calculated game, and won. The party was over, the accounting was complete, and justice finally was being served.